Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this Mountaineers Books web event. I'm Doug Canfield, and this evening's presentation is by Chandra LeGue, the author of Oregon's Ancient Forests, a Hiking Guide. Chandra's new guidebook is published by Mountaineers Books in partnership with Oregon Wild, where Chandra is Western Oregon Field Coordinator. Oregon's Ancient Forests is a guidebook with a purpose, and that purpose is to highlight the importance of the final remaining ancient forests in Oregon. This book includes ecology information as well as hikes where you can experience these unique ecosystems for yourself. We have some great partners for tonight's presentation. Of course, there's Oregon Wild. Oregon Wild is a nonprofit whose mission is to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for future generations. Please visit OregonWild.org to find out how you can get involved in this effort. Adventure Scientists is also a co-sponsor. This interesting nonprofit collects and provides important environmental data to partners who use it to find solutions to environmental issues. Adventure Scientists invite you to join them as a citizen scientist. They will train you in how to collect small samples from key timber species, which will help the U.S. Forest Service to combat illegal logging. You can learn more and also volunteer at adventurescientists.org/timber. And we want to acknowledge the help of Outdoor Project, the Greater Hells Canyon Council, and also the Great Old Broads for Wilderness, which has to be the best name ever for an NGO, for inviting their communities to join us this evening. If you're here from one of these organizations, welcome. We will be giving you the URLs for these groups in a follow-up email along with the recording of tonight's presentation that you can rewatch or share with a friend. Tonight's presentation will last about 35 minutes and be followed with questions and answers. You can ask a question anytime during the presentation by using the question box that you can see on the right side of your screen. We'll save your questions for Chandra to answer after she has finished her presentation. So, okay, let's get started. Chandra, the audience is all yours.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks to everyone who is out there. Well, you're all here, I'm guessing, because you like to hike, hence your interest in this book. Well, welcome to the club. Whether you love hiking for the exercise, for the views of waterfalls or mountains, to discover new places, or just to commune with nature and everything that contributes to its majesty, experiencing Oregon on foot on any number of our gorgeous trails is a great way to go. My love for the outdoors and hiking goes back to my Michigan childhood, where I got to explore in the woods, camp, sail, and hike. Moving to Oregon 20 years ago just put that love in overdrive when I got to discover the wonders of Oregon's forests. And I'm lucky enough to actually get to do some hiking for my job with Oregon Wild. Every month or two, I lead hikes for the public to one of my favorite places. I get to share my passion for nature and forests and to talk with folks about what has been done and what they can do to help ensure that the place we're hiking is protected from logging or other damaging management. And I've got a lot to draw on. I've been working for Oregon Wild out of our Eugene, Oregon office for nearly 16 years. Oregon Wild's mission is to protect and restore our wildlands, wildlife, and waters. And our staff and thousands of supporters have been working to fulfill that mission for 45 years. It's a big one. There's a lot of beautiful places in Oregon to work to protect. And we've had a great deal of success in many ways, as well as challenges, and we have a lot of work still going on. And while forests aren't explicitly called out in the words of our mission, protecting forests and advocating for their restoration has always been an integral part of Oregon Wild's work. We've been involved in getting protections for northern spotted owls, Pacific salmon, and other wildlife that depend on the forest ecosystems that have been diminished and fragmented over the past century. We've been involved in gaining permanent protections for wilderness areas like the Three Sisters, the Strawberry Mountains, and most recently, and one of my favorite places, the Devil's Staircase Wilderness, which a beautiful grove of old forest is pictured on the left-hand side of your screen in the Devil's Staircase Wilderness. Oregon Wild's also fought for roadless area protection for 2 million acres of Oregon's forests And we've challenged management plans that have been developed by federal agencies that would ramp up logging on already fragmented forests in our backyards on BLM forests, the Bureau of Land Management. And we've supported protections for places like the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument on BLM land. So as important and fun as leading hikes is, I also get to be an advocate for Oregon's forests with my job. From defending policies and laws that are meant to protect and guide the restoration, to working with federal agencies to ensure ecologically sound management of our public lands. And the fact is, our forests need advocates, and here's why. Over the last century, we've destroyed or fragmented almost all of the diverse, thriving forests in Oregon. About half of Oregon is forested, or once was, and today only about 15 to 20% of what was once ancient forests remain across the state. The rest has been logged, fragmented by roads, grazed, or otherwise developed. This has had huge impacts on our once thriving forest ecosystems and everything that they provide for all of us, which I'll cover a bit more in just a minute. First, I want to tell a short story that's out of the book that I hope illustrates what's at stake. So this is from the first chapter of the book. From a small lake on the western slope of the Cascades, where some friends and I had set up our tents beneath towering western hemlocks and red cedars the night before, we all set off through the dense forest following the stream flowing from the lake. There was no trail. We were deep in the wild and in rugged country where trail building and maintenance were not prudent endeavors. And the shrubs, evergreen huckleberry, Oregon grape, devil's club, formed green walls, making forward progress difficult. Climbing up on fallen logs 3 to 5 feet thick, we followed an elevated highway, our path a giant array of pickup sticks. Whenever we needed a short break from the strenuous route, we gazed upward in awe at the towering trees surrounding us. The world was draped in countless shades of green, stacked in lacy layers. Everything smelled fresh and dirty and old at the same time. Small openings in the forest stood out, washed in sunshine. Birds and squirrels flittered in the underbrush, heard but not seen. We continued for hours, taking it all in. We stopped for lunch, damp, warm, scratched up, but reveling in the beauty and loving every second of the experience, in a grove of some of the fattest, tallest trees I'd ever seen. It was the epitome of peace, of joy, of camaraderie with nature and each other. And while my friends perched on logs to enjoy their sandwiches, I wandered away for a vantage point, looking to capture the moment, which is pictured on the left here, with my camera. Using the thick bark of a giant tree, I pulled myself up onto a down log. Leaning on the giant and steadying myself for the photo, my hand hit paper. I looked and my heart dropped. It was a marker for a timber sale. The sign that I encountered that afternoon in the magnificent ancient forest grove was, fortunately, also ancient. The imminent threat to that grove, very real 15 years earlier, had been neutralized, thanks to the persistent and adamant actions of citizens who also valued that special place. As federal land managers prepared to build a road and rev up the chainsaws in that grove, forest advocates ensured that it was instead protected as the Opal Creek Wilderness. Opal Creek is a truly special place, if any of you have been there, and it's today one of Oregon's most treasured wilderness areas. But without passionate advocates for its protections, it too could have been destroyed. So the Opal Creek example was essentially the setting for the 1991 book that was the inspiration for my new book, Oregon's Ancient Forests. Written by Wendell Wood, who worked and volunteered for Oregon Wild for much of its history, the book came at a time when we were still logging ancient forests at an astounding rate in Oregon. Wendell was a phenomenal naturalist, a fierce advocate for forests, for the Klamath River Basin, and all wild places. He saw the potential in a hiking guide that would inspire people to visit our last remaining ancient forests and inspire them to get involved in the efforts to protect them. Today, nearly 30 years later, groups like Oregon Wild are still fighting some of the same battles that Wendell was. While some of these forests have been protected as wilderness or as roadless areas, or they have new strong management policies, others are still under threat from corporate greed, from loopholes in protective laws, and from political forces that prioritize corporate profits over trees and ecosystems that are centuries old. So, a book for a new generation of Oregonians, of forest lovers and hikers is still very relevant. So I'm really glad that Mountaineers Books took the leap to publish it. Okay, I'm going to take a step back for a moment now and sort of talk about what we're talking about when we say ancient forests. It's a term that maybe not everyone's familiar with and isn't actually defined as, a scientific term. People might be more familiar with the term old growth or virgin forest. But I feel like that doesn't quite capture what an ancient forest is. It's more about the age of a forest, for example, and no one likes to be defined solely by their age, right? So an ancient forest is a lot more about a forest that's been allowed to grow and develop naturally without much human intervention over a long period of time. So it's a bit of a broad definition, and that's on purpose because all forests are different. Natural forests are really dynamic. Disturbances are always changing things. So healthy old forests aren't just big trees. There are lots of younger trees. As you can see in this picture, there's a multi-layered canopy often with different species of trees in the understory, with shrubs, with a mixture of densities as you look around the forest. There's, of course, giant, big live trees, but there's also dead trees called snags that are standing in the forest, sometimes remain standing for centuries. There's also trees that have died and fallen to the forest floor, and those down logs can provide new life and nutrient cycling in these forests. So they're highly diverse and are far more than just the big old trees in them. Here's an example of some of the amazing biodiversity that can be found in ancient forests. They're really diverse at every scale. So there's an example here of some mosses and lichens in the upper left, which are vital pieces of the forest ecosystem. There's a nurse log, a down tree that has some hemlocks growing out of it, because those logs can capture and hold a lot of moisture and nutrients in the forest. There's also a tree that's recently fallen in the upper right that clearly has been standing for a long time, and woodpeckers have bored into it, creating homes for animals into the future. Fires also burn through ancient forests, and I'll talk a bit more about fire in a little while. But those create openings at different scales that allow for more light to come into the forest, where there's more wildflowers and shrubs that can grow up, which create great habitat for all sorts of animals that can use that as food. And then soil is also an important component of the diversity in a forest. So fungus live throughout the soil and help trees take up nutrients, can actually create a network of communication. It's been proven with a lot of research to show that the fungal network in a forest help communicate and share resources across different trees. So there's just tons of diversity, and all of those pieces are vitally important. In fact, forests are essential for a lot of the things that we often take for granted. They are essential to the water that we use and drink. For salmon and other fish that live in the water, and of course they're beautiful places to hike along. So forest trees offer shade and cool streams, which is vital for salmon. Healthy soils help filter the water as it falls. It also helps regulate water runoff, which I don't know if anyone can hear this, but there's a torrential downpour outside my office right now. It is fall in Oregon, and I'm watching it all run off in the street outside my office, which wouldn't be happening in a forest. That would be soaking into the forest soil and being filtered and slowly released out into the watershed, which is a vital service that our forests play for us. Forests also are providing basically the base of a food chain for a whole stream ecosystem. Leaf litter and logs fall into streams, and that provides food for all sorts of microorganisms that then feed larger organisms that then feed salmon. So having those large trees that do that is really important too. Ancient forests are also amazing wildlife habitat. Whether you get to see all of the wildlife that is out there in Oregon's forests is another question. But from big to small, wildlife find the diversity of ancient forests really important. So I mentioned woodpeckers already that seek food in dead trees. Millipedes, like the one pictured here, break down and decompose leaf litter and needle litter that falls in the forest and provide a vital service. And spotted owls, like that one in the lower right, which are threatened because we have logged so much of their ancient forest habitat, depend on that multi-layered canopy and the spacing and the shelter of ancient forests in Western Oregon in particular. So they're really wonderful places for all sorts of wildlife. And perhaps most importantly these days, ancient forests, especially those that grow very old, are also vital for our climate. As we hear about the ongoing destruction of the Amazon rainforest, it's important to know that our forests in the Pacific Northwest also play a huge role in removing carbon pollution from the atmosphere and storing it over time. Protecting ancient forests means long-term climate change insurance, which we need. And these forests are also important in adapting to a warming climate. Older, biodiverse forests that have all the components that I've been talking about are important refuges for wildlife because they're cooler and shadier and have all that structure. It's important, again, for cooling and filtering water as the climate warms. And these older forests are more resilient to wildfires, which may become more prevalent. So the thing is that the damage and fragmentation of Oregon's ancient forest ecosystems means that our water, our wildlife, and a livable climate are all at risk. It means that protecting the last scraps of these forests so they can filter water, store carbon, and shelter birds and pollinators is essential for all of our survival. So I've talked a lot about how very little is left, but I have managed to write a book with nearly 100 hikes in these forests. So they're out there. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about where they are. So this map that's up right now is a map from the book. It shows the different regions that the book is broken up into. And so I thought this was a good backdrop to talk about where the ancient forests are left. First, to get it out of the way, these forests are highly fragmented and in small patches because of the past logging and road building that I've already talked about. There's really just about 20% of the remaining forests that are found in blocks larger than 1,000 acres, which is, I don't know, kind of an arbitrary number, but it's a good one to, it's a good size to think about where a forest might actually be able to provide all those functions that we just went over, filtering water, providing wildlife habitat. But there are some large patches left, and they're found on federal public land. That's where there are all these different layers of protections and policies and laws that have protected them, thanks to all the advocates that have worked on that over the years. So one layer of protections is wilderness. It's large W wilderness, protected under the Wilderness Act that only Congress can designate. And of Oregon's about 3 million acres of wilderness, over 80% of those wilderness areas are forested and ancient forests. So we have a lot of ancient forests protected in that way. Roadless areas protected under the Roadless rule, enacted in the early 2000s, also protects about 2 million acres of ancient forests in Oregon that are not fragmented. And then there's a lot of various management plans that the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management have in place on our public lands that do offer some protections for these forests, though often that's in those smaller scattered patches. There's also wild and scenic rivers, which is a designation, again, that Congress can pass. And Oregon has a lot of wild and scenic rivers. We have 2,100 miles of these rivers that also protect a corridor along each stream, and that amounts to about 500,000 acres of ancient forest protected in that way. There are also national monuments and parks in Oregon. Crater Lake National Park has ancient forests, and then our national monuments, the Oregon Caves and the Cascade Siskiyou, also have ancient forests. There's some ancient forests on Bureau of Land Management land, which is the sort of peach color on that map. But mostly just in Western Oregon and mostly in very fragmented patches because of the nature of those lands. And there also aren't that many trails in them. Of course, this is leaving out about half of the state of Oregon's forests. The other half that's not federal public land belongs to the state of Oregon, that's in yellow on this map, or is privately owned. And the laws that govern those forests really prioritize logging. And so the last ancient forests left on our state lands are primarily in state parks in small pieces, though there is some left in the Elliott State Forest, which is a large block in the Central Coast Range. But the rest of the private forest lands have been extensively logged. They continue to be, and until laws are changed, there will be no more ancient forests on there because they will continue to be logged. So the book is divided into those 14 regions shown on that previous map, and there's 91 hikes there. So I want to just go through some of the things you might expect to see in this book. You have all the standard stuff that you might find in any modern hiking guide. There's a table at the beginning that tells you, that lists all the hikes by region, by their difficulty, and has a brief description so you can pick out a hike that's somewhere you are planning to go or that meets your ability levels. Each hike description has driving directions, GPS coordinates, tells you whether you need a parking permit, things like that. And then the description tells you what you might see along the trail. The thing that's most unique about this book is that description and the context that's written into each of the regional highlights really focuses on the forest ecosystem, the ecology, the types of trees you might see, as well as the protection status and how each of the areas is managed. So is it in a national forest? Is it in a protected wilderness? You know, how hard did people have to work to protect it, or is it still unprotected? So the book offers all of that sort of information, as well as some great sidebars and pages that go into some of the forest ecology about how forests store carbon, about how soil functions, how forests filter water, all that kind of good stuff. So one example that is focused on in the book is Oregon's forest types. So this map is in the book as well, and has some of the most common forest types across Oregon. And forest types are really determined by the specific geography of an area, geography and geology and climate, and are grouped together by tree species as well as other characteristics. So we have a lot of diversity there. We have a small forest type that's quaking aspen that are found in usually small pockets, but are unique enough to be their own forest type. We have in yellow on this map ponderosa pine forest types, which covers a lot of central and eastern Oregon. On the Oregon coast, we have the coastal fog zone forests that are dominated by Sitka spruce and western red cedar and Douglas fir and are very moist. And then across western Oregon and a lot of the Pacific Northwest, we have the ubiquitous Douglas fir forest type, dominated by Douglas fir as well as red cedar and western hemlock, and kind of has that classic old growth forest feel that many people might be familiar with. So I thought I'd go into a few of my favorite hikes to give you a little taste of what's on offer. The first one in the Central Coast Range region is Mary's Peak. Mary's Peak is the highest peak in Oregon's Coast Range. It's part of the Siuslaw National Forest, and it doesn't have too many protections other than it is in Corvallis's drinking watershed, and the management plan here dictates that you don't log forests that are over 80 years old. This forest is beautiful, and because it's a higher elevation than most places in the Coast Range, it has a unique noble fir component, as well as beautiful meadows and a view at the top. One of the downsides to hiking in Oregon's Coast Range is that a lot of it has been clear cut. It's heavily fragmented, and so when you drive to Mary's Peak, you get to see a lot of that, which is very informative, but also lets you know how important the forest there at Mary's Peak is. Down on the South Coast, in our South Coast region, we get to see something pretty unique in Oregon, and that's the Oregon Redwoods. There's 2 trails in the Oregon Redwoods on the very south part of the coast, and a lot of people don't know that we have redwoods in Oregon, but they don't know the difference between California and Oregon. So they actually do come up into Oregon, and there's some beautiful redwood forests left here. There would have been more if the 1980s and 90s had didn't have the forest advocates that they did. Wendell Wood, in particular, who wrote that original book, worked really hard to protect Oregon's remaining redwood forests. Otherwise, they may have met the same fate as much of California's, which is to have been cut down. But these areas are protected today under the management plans, and thanks to public opinion that really doesn't want to see any more of these ancient redwoods logged. Over in the Siskiyou Crest region, east of Ashland, there's a really great hike called Grizzly Peak. It's in the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument on land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The forest here is very diverse. It's the Siskiyou mixed conifer forest type, and it so happens it's also recovering from a fire. I actually included a lot of hikes in the book that have burned over the last 30 or so years. And that's because of my definition of ancient forests. It means that they've grown and developed naturally over a long period of time. And fires are a part of that. Pretty much all of Oregon's forests have been born out of fire. Forests have been recovering from fire naturally for millennia, and this hike is no exception. The whole hike isn't in this burned area, but some of it is. And it's a great opportunity to discover how forests do recover after fire, to see all the different shrubs and young trees that are growing back, to think about the different wildlife that might use this area as opposed to a dense forest area. And it's also just as a great view. All right, in my backyard, out of Eugene, is the Mackenzie River Trail, and there's a couple of different hikes in the book featured that are on the Mackenzie River Trail. This is one of the classic, sort of structure of Douglas fir forest that people envision when they think of old growth. And it's on the Willamette National Forest. It's the headwaters of the Mackenzie River, which is one of the major tributaries to the Willamette, and the source of the drinking water for our Eugene community. Part of the Mackenzie is protected as a wild and scenic river, and so some of the corridor and the forests along it are also protected. Moving south from there, getting into the Umpqua River watershed and the upper Umpqua, one of my favorite hikes in all of Oregon is Twin Lakes. It's in a part of the proposed Crater Lake Wilderness, a campaign that Oregon Wild's been working on for some time, along with others, in a designated roadless area, which means that it's not threatened by logging, And in fact, from this vantage point in this picture, looking to the north, you can see the Boulder Creek wilderness, and also you can see Diamond Peak, which is also surrounded by wilderness. So this landscape has a lot of protections in the vicinity, and also just to the east of here is Crater Lake National Park. So it's getting into higher elevation, but it's dominated by the Douglas fir forest type. But there's also, because we're getting into southern Oregon a little bit, there's incense cedar and Shasta red fir, which are beautiful, beautiful trees. And in addition, this forest has beautiful wildflower meadows, views from the top, as this one, and a fire burned a few years ago in along part of the hike. So you get quite a diversity. Moving over into eastern Oregon, in the Umatilla National Forest and the northern Blue Mountains, this hike, the South Fork Desolation Creek hike, is one of my favorites as well. It's in a designated roadless area, so it has some protections, and it's also in the Vinegar Hill Indian Rock Scenic Area, which is really popular with hunters. There's a lot of deer and elk in the area. And I found this whole northern Blue Mountains region to be unexpectedly diverse. I hadn't really been there before writing the book, and found the mixture of trees in this mixed conifer forest to be just simply wonderful. This picture shows lodgepole pine and western larch, which is a cool combination. And this corner of Oregon, and the northeast corner of Oregon, is home to some of the wildlife that need big wild places like this large roadless area and some of the wilderness areas there. It's a place where wolves are making a recovery, and where wolf food lives. A lot of deer and elk, as I said, and also interesting and rare creatures such as moose live up in this corner of Oregon in these forests. Okay, and finally, in the Blue Mountains region, really in the center of Oregon and to the east, in the Malheur National Forest, there's some really spectacular hikes in the ponderosa pine forest type. This hike in the Malheur River Canyon features some of those ancient ponderosa pines, but also has lovely streamside vegetation where it hasn't been grazed. And it's protected as a wild and scenic river, and so logging won't be allowed in this protected corridor. There's beautiful ponderosa pine and larch trees here as well. The problem, much like in Western Oregon with clear cuts, is that grazing of cattle on national forest lands have led to a lot of degradation and can take away from our recreation experience, even in wild and scenic river corridors where grazing is still allowed at some times of the year. So something to keep in mind, that even with protections, there can still be damage done by human activities. All right, and finally, I just wanted to end with sort of some of the spirit of the book that I wanted to get at. Obviously, part of the point of the book is getting all of you who might take a hike to become advocates for protecting these places. But I also want people to go into the forest with a sense of curiosity and a spirit of exploration. And so I offer some tips throughout the book for enjoying the ancient forests that hopefully are helpful to folks. So I encourage people to carefully explore off trail if you see a particularly huge tree that you want to go check out. Don't be afraid to do that. I encourage people to use the resources that are at the end of the book, different guidebooks for tree identification, for edible plant identification, so you get to know what's around you. For example, going out at this time of year in Oregon, if you know what huckleberries look like, you're going to have a much better time than if you think they're all poisonous because they're delicious. And so having that background and going into the forest with that context is great. And going with that sense of curiosity means thinking about where the forest that you're hiking in came from. How did it develop? The picture in the lower right is a picture of my boss exploring a big tree in southern Oregon that has obviously been burnt. And he kind of walked in there and was poking around and thinking about when did this burn? I wonder how long ago that was. And, looking up into the canopy and thinking about, whether that tree was damaged in the fire and how long it might live. It just adds a way of bringing your detective into the forest, and can mean a lot of fun. Okay, well, I know that Doug's going to wrap up in a second, but before we get to that, I just want to say that I hope this book, if you get a chance to pick it up, helps you all have truly amazing experiences in our ancient forests. But of course, I also hope that it inspires you to take action and to give back to these forests. If you love living in or visiting Oregon, and for all that its forests have to offer, I really encourage you to learn more, to get involved in groups like Oregon Wild, through volunteering, through membership, and become an advocate for these forests in any way that you can, because they're stunningly beautiful. They're inspiring in so many ways. They provide us with a home, with clean water, with other creatures to share a home with, and with a climate that we can all live in. So they're vitally important to all of us, and to me. I was really lucky to have this opportunity to write this book and to share my passion for these forests with all of you. So thank you.
Oh, that was, thanks. That was great, Chandra. I found that really interesting. I know one of my kids asked me, we were camping this summer, and he asked me, what kind of tree is that, Dad? And I didn't know. I didn't have any idea. So the idea of reading your book and learning some of those species, and even a half dozen of them, I think will be a lot of fun, and more fun to go on a hike and know something about the ecology. Anyway, we do have a few questions, so let's look at those. Steve, who has written that he's from Everett, Washington, apparently happy to come your way to do some hiking. He says, your book was inspired by an update to Wendell Wood's original book. Any reflections between what he originally wrote about and what you ended up seeing during your researching of this updated guidebook?
Yeah, definitely. And I should say that I had the privilege of using Wendell's book for many years, and even going on some of the hikes with him before he passed away. So I was pretty familiar with the book. I would say that some of the key differences that I found in the nearly 30 years since it was published was that was really that fires burned. A lot of the forests that I visited that were, in his book have burned, at least in part. And as I said, that's, a perfectly natural part of the ecosystem and offers us a lot to learn. But the places that were logged after fires were pretty devastating. That was a key takeaway. When I visited some of the places that had burned, that he had in his book, I saw a lot of regrowth unless they had been logged. And that's where those forests really probably won't come back in the same way for a very long time. And so that was kind of a lesson on what we need to do, what we need to change management-wise on our forests. There actually was a remarkable amount of the hikes that were in his book that were pretty similar to how he described them. In fact, there was one hike where he described a particular ponderosa pine tree that had 4 tops and said how interesting it was and unique that this tree had 4 tops. And that tree was still standing. and I found it, exactly where he found it. So even though forests are very dynamic and, a lot of the conditions on the ground have changed, it's remarkable to be able to find some of the same things, a generation later. So that's another fun takeaway.
Bob asks, do you have a favorite trail close to the U of O?
Yeah. I mean, close is relative. Outside of Eugene, within 30 minutes to an hour, there's a lot of great trails. So one I would recommend that's probably one of the closest is the Goodman Creek Trail. It's out Highway 58, southeast of Eugene, right on the side of that highway, and has a beautiful, beautiful ancient forest, as well as other trails that connect to that. So that would be a top recommendation. It's close to home and really, pretty easy and beautiful.
Okay, I hope I don't butcher this person's name. It looks like Genesis, and she asks, what's the difference between a roadless area and a wilderness area?
Great question. Well, there's kind of two levels of roadless areas. One is called an inventoried roadless area, so that is sort of the official roadless area. And that was those were designated in the roadless rule that I mentioned in the early 2000s. It's an inventory that the Forest Service took of unroaded areas that are quite large, usually over 5,000 acres in size. And the rule that protects those is an administrative policy, which means it's not a law. And that means that it can be revoked more easily than overturning a law. So the Wilderness Act is a law that says that Congress can protect places. And so once Congress enacts that law to protect a wilderness, it'd be very difficult. In fact, I don't believe there's any precedent to overturn wilderness protections, whereas there's plenty of precedent for overturning administrative policies, which the roadless rule is. So that's the key difference.
Okay, so we have John, who's has joined us from Brewster, New York, and he asks, do you have any experience with forest bathing during your excursions? If so, which locations?
Yeah, I believe that's referring to the Japanese concept of forest bathing. I don't know the Japanese term, which really espouses the health benefits of just being in the forest. There might be something more to it than that, and if there is, I probably won't be able to point to exactly where I had those specific experiences, but in general, every one of these hikes was a forest bathing experience. I learned to really slow down when I was doing the hikes for this book, in part because I was taking notes and taking pictures along the way, and taking more care in observing what I saw. And so that meant I moved slower and sat longer. And that's where I feel like all the beauty, all the heightened senses that come with having that amazing forest experience come in. So yeah, I'm just gonna say it all was a forest bathing experience.
Okay. Jamie asks, what is the best thing we can do when on a hike to preserve our forests?
While you're on a hike, I would say the easiest thing is really just to practice, your leave no trace principles. Tread lightly, don't leave any litter behind, and encourage anyone else that you encounter to do the same. And have a lot of respect for the forest that you're in, for the wildlife. Keeping your dog on a leash, for example, is a way of respecting the other life forms in the forest. So that's the best way while you're on your hike. But when you're home, I would definitely say that looking up information about how who manages the forest, and getting involved in any local groups that are working on protecting or advocating for the forest would be what you do once you come home.
Okay. Lisa asks, did you have any scary wildlife encounters on your various research hikes?
Scary is relative, I suppose, but I definitely encountered a lot of bear scat along the trail, which made my heart race because I was usually alone. I did carry bear spray, and I know to make noise and not startle bears, so I did that. And I never actually had a close encounter with one. When I saw a moose, that also got my heart racing because I've heard stories about how they can be a little scary. They're big and powerful. Luckily, this one was far enough away with its baby nearby that I wasn't too afraid that it was going to charge me. And then on one trail in Central Oregon, there were signs about rattlesnakes, and so I didn't actually see one. But again, it's there was all those warnings in the air that made me be extra cautious, which I think helps prevent wildlife encounters. Honestly, is being cautious, being aware of your surroundings and what could be out there. Often makes it easier to avoid those scary encounters.
Okay, so last question is from me, and I'm watching you there. And are you in your office?
I am.
Those fancy digs, we
Lots
nonprofit
of
people
old file
all have.
cabinets with very old bumper stickers.
Hey, thank you so much for this evening. We've run out of questions, and we appreciate the audience as well for joining us tonight. We have 3 copies of Oregon's Ancient Forest that we're going to give away, and we'll draw those tomorrow and get back to the folks that have won those within the next couple of days to get your addresses. In any case, if you don't win a book, you can pick up a copy wherever books are sold, and also on our website, mountaineersbooks.org, where if you use this code, Big Trees, BIGTREES, you'll receive a 20% discount. Again, the discount code is Big Trees, but if you don't have a pencil, don't worry about it. We're going to email that to you, that code to you in a day or two when we send you a recording of Chandra's address and the URLs of our partners. So please check our website to find the date of our next web event. Check back with us. And also you can find there are many other author events. Hopefully some of them will be close to your home. In the meantime, we hope you'll be enjoying all that the outdoors has to offer. So good night. Thanks again for joining us. Bye now.